Okay, it's a pleasure to welcome, I was going to say welcome here, but what I meant by that was that I think it's the first time Ross has given a lecture here, and for that we do indeed welcome him, as it were, to the first of what I hope is many. Brett, Ross.
One step at a time.
Yeah, I obviously have high hopes for him. Ross is in kind of the last lap, really, of his thesis, which he's doing at the, I suppose I better call it the Once and Future London Consortium. And it's an extremely spirited, critical, even in some sense, although it's largely theoretical, a really quite militant critique of the categories of conventional urbanism. He's going to present, I think, some of the work on circulation this evening, and we look forward to it. So if you want to suggest to him actually to cut out the word ontology, I shall be more than happy. But otherwise it looks fine. Okay, Ross.
Thank you. Hello. So I suppose a good way to kind of start this is to introduce the way I'm kind of approaching this whole question. I mean, in my past I've been an architect and an urban designer, and I think what I've sort of learned through this time is to approach this question or to somehow, or let's say for me at this moment, I think the most pressing questions for urban design or for architecture in a way are discursive questions. And in fact, I'm teaching right now in a new program in the Bartlett, which is incredibly fascinating because I think it's the first program that I know of actually that's really approaching the question of urban design from a sort of discursive standpoint. So kind of attacking the problem from kind of these categories of the discourse. And I suppose for me, the best way to start is to say that really what underpins my research is a kind of discursive question. I think this kind of courses throughout the whole of my research, which is really what is the urban? So we all, of course, are architects, let's say, or urbanists or whatever. We all, even if we're not, we all live somehow in the urban, or at least over 50% of the world lives in the urban now. We build in it, we think about it, we talk about it, but actually we don't really necessarily know what it means. And in fact, I think very few people are really asking this question today, what is the urban? So in sort of kind of answering what this question is, I want to focus on a particular aspect of the urban, of urbanization if you want, which really opens up a certain relationship between the urban and as a sort of spatio-technical order if you want, and political form, which maybe underpins it. And in a way, I think the best way to sort of begin this is to really take the history of modern architecture almost as an object of study itself. And to sort of start to examine it. And what we see, of course, is that the history of the modern city or modern urbanism is really a history of movement. It's a history of infrastructure. So really, for every new kind of development or every new urbanism, if you want, invented, the means of its innovation are undoubtedly infrastructural. There's a kind of endless faith that urbanists continue to place in modes of circulation. In a way, we kind of conflate a social wealth with the infinite networks and corridors of human connectivity. And I think for us, really, infrastructure appears as sort of a default, kind of a default materiality by which our sort of global society now sort of mediates its needs. So it's inevitably the medium which resolves crises and also that from which crises emerge. And this, for example, is the eco corridor, which for me is really the sort of, let's say, degree zero of this fetishization, if you want, or fascination with infrastructure. It's really a moment where we can imagine that nature itself, or the natural world, is really a sort of material or substance that remains a kind of latent infrastructure in itself, in which, you know, nature itself is meant to circulate now. So we push nature down and it circulates back and forth. And in a sense, I think today we really cannot imagine a world not conditioned by and determined by infrastructure. So it's kind of the beginning and end of our imagination, if you want. And obviously this basic diagram has really entered into the field of architecture, where we can imagine, for example, Koolhaas's embassy, an embassy being structured completely around a single corridor. Of course, CCTV is a kind of this loop, you know, this sort of subway map we have showing the movement through. And then, on the other hand, like the materialization of these diagrams of circulation really also can become themselves architectural centerpieces, where stairways and corridors form the sort of, you know, the centerpiece of this Maxi Museum by Zaha. And if you don't believe me, have a look at the website. And, you know, I think in say, the 90s or so, when there was this great discovery by Koolhaas and Schumi of program, you know, as this liberating force of architectural form, there's really a sort of silent history behind that, which is the kind of triumph of circulation at the same time. So, you know, we all know we can't really begin a project today without establishing a certain truth in a kind of circulatory diagram. I mean, this is where our architecture begins. So in a way, my question is not really to say, you know, how is this history structured? Who are the main innovators of this? And what were the main technological innovations which allowed this sort of circulatory dominance to arise? Rather, I think it's kind of the opposite. So for me, it's much more a question like, how did circulation, as a kind of concept we all take for granted today, how did it become so epistemologically bound up in the city? When did this sort of displacement take place? So how did circulation kind of enter as a concern for the city? And of course, then what is the relationship between circulation and urbanization, which is, again, a category which I think we all understand so well, but also completely misunderstand at the same time. But of course, more fundamentally to all this is really a question, what is the relationship between circulation and power? So in other words, not only is it like who has access to nodes and mobilities and this kind of thing and who doesn't, but is there kind of political consistency really embedded in movement itself, in the kind of materiality? Is there politics in the materiality of circulation? So I think for me, really, the problem is a kind of historical one. And this is really because when we begin to interrogate the sort of modern history of architecture with these questions, we inevitably get a kind of answer that we already know, which is really that, you know, the whole history, like basically infrastructure, technology, movement, network, circulation, all of this have really become central to political and economic organization of the modern world, and therefore our space somehow reflects that. So it's a sort of tautological kind of way to go about. And as we know, you know, the history of the modern Western city always begins by insisting on this sort of historical divide, and this is something I just want to reflect on briefly for a moment. This kind of chasm between what you could call the classical Renaissance world and the modern world. And of course, in Benevolo, I'm just taking him as an example because he was on my bookshelf as a very wonderful historian, of course. But really, you know, history so many times appears in this kind of form where you have a sort of 2-volume set of books with each about the same length of pages and each given in the same basic form. They all have a kind of beginning, a middle, and end, and they're sort of enclosed with these very specific attributes of, you know, what makes sort of Renaissance history complete and what makes the sort of modern history itself complete. And of course, you know, as the history sort of plays itself out, what we see is that the pre-modern city is always described as this sort of piecemeal sort of planning where, you know, scenographic and artistic composition play the main role. Whereas in the modern city, it's more a question of a kind of a systematic, a biological, and definitely a kind of technological approach to planning of the 19th century. So of course, as the history of the modern city goes, the story tells us that, it's really this sort of innocent outcome of a kind of new way of life made possible by novel technologies of communication and circulation, all of which are ushered in, of course, by the graces of the liberal nation state. Obviously none of this is really wrong, and I don't want to say, this is all rubbish or something. But it simply constructs a history around a very silent meta-narrative which plays itself out. And really that meta-narrative is itself constructed around a sort of introduction of technology and the sort of pursuit of liberty as basically the new determinate forces which are at play in the sort of modern architectural and urban world. And so built around, I think, this divide, we have ideas, these kind of categories, if you want, like progress, society, capitalism, liberty, the idea of the individual, technology, and so on. And I think, from my standpoint, all of these are really products, in part, of this kind of historical divide. Not to say that they are not also, real things, let's say, but very much emphasized by this kind of historical divide. And in this sense, I think they help us to grant the 19th and indeed the 20th centuries with a sort of historical autonomy. And in that sense, also, in turn, this radical, if you want, separation really allows us to take these terms as innocent categories, as really categories or universals, if you want, which appear as ahistorical and apolitical, categories without a politics or history. They simply are in the modern. And so I think, for me, what's interesting to approach, what's interesting about approaching the kind of modern city is really if we can kind of begin to examine critically these categories. And if we do, we see, I think, in my point at least, that really there's one that stands out above all the others, or at least begins to kind of underpin all the other categories in one way or another. And for me, the question then is why? Why is it that mobility, circulation, ideas of movement seem to really predominate as a certain core principle, if you want, of modernity? So basically what I want to argue tonight is really that circulation and sovereign power have a very intimate and long-standing or historical relationship, which really not only traverses this divide of extending far back into history, but in fact really persists in a very effective way, or sort of unity, let's say today, within the category of the urban. So in other words, if circulation gave the modern city its kind of raison d'être, or its sort of fundamental principle, in the 19th century it did so only as a kind of overt political intention. And this is precisely what remains invisible when we kind of divide history in two like this and insist on this kind of artificial divide. So basically what I want to just lay out tonight, first I want to look a bit into this rise of urbanization, and I want to examine the sort of deliberate use of circulation as a way to kind of construct a new space and indeed a new political horizon altogether. Then I'm going to briefly then trace this concept of circulation back into history somehow to find out sort of what happened before it had anything indeed to do with the city or even space at all. And in that sense, to look at basically the construction of, how circulation was used to construct early forms of modern political power. And from there, I think what we can do is come back and start to understand this relation, how circulation became a kind of spatial and material sort of diagram, if you want, although not a diagram, and in a sense, how it entered into the thinking and planning of the city and the territory. So in the sense, what I want to do is really, again, to traverse this divide that I've sort of pointed out with this historical sort of dogma, if you want. So looking into urbanization, well, what is urbanization? What's interesting, I think, is that in the 19th century, I'll explain this in a minute, there was really this, there is very much this intense spirit of a kind of historical autonomy at play. Really the beginning of the 19th century, after the French Revolution in Europe, there really is a sense that there's a new kind of dawn of history opening up. And it was all, of course, underpinned by a certain intoxicating faith in technologies of mobility and circulation. And really it was in this spirit that the first theory of the city, or indeed the first theory of urbanization was written. And this is why, for me, Cerda, if you know, is a very interesting starting point. For one, he's the designer of he's a civil engineer, first of all, to make that point clear. But he's the designer of what's called the Reform and Extension of Barcelona. So perhaps many of you know this project, but it was actually built in more or less its integrity of how he wanted it. But I think much more important to me is not so much the planning of Barcelona, but really the teoria, the theory of urbanization he wrote. It's 1,500 pages document, which proposed an incredibly bold kind of theory, which in a sense he was proposing to replace, or not so much to kind of describe a new way of making cities, a sort of modern way of making cities, but rather a kind of a universal template for constructing a new form of cohabitation altogether. And this is what he called the urbe. It's basically the city reduced to two things: dwelling and mobility, dwelling and circulation. And what I find fascinating is behind this, he had this very core principle, which indeed directed and determined every single element and every decision made within the urbe. And this was this notion of vialidad, which basically is another term he coined, which also exists today in Spanish. But for him, it really was this kind of idealism of unlimited circulation. For me, this is significant in a few ways. So first of all, I think he really manages to capture a moment. I don't think he's the first and then everyone somehow followed Cerda, actually quite the opposite. I think he manages to capture a certain, let's say, spirit, that's not the right word, or an attitude in the time, whereby almost every urbanist and architect who theorized and thought about the city would sort of follow the patterns. So circulation remained at the kind of center throughout the 20th century, and I think even, I would argue, up until today, of any sort of urban design or urban planning. But also, more than that, I think by making this principle the center, it would really paradoxically undermine the city itself. So indeed, Cerda would argue that with this kind of natural forces of technology and mobility, along with this sort of new pursuit of liberty that was kind of unfurling across Europe, really the city itself as a sort of formal, fixed, spatially enclosed, historical entity would indeed soon be eclipsed by something different altogether. In that sense, he really saw the city as an artifact that either had to be reformed radically or completely abandoned altogether. And what's interesting, I think, is that what replaces the city for him is not another fixed kind of spatial entity, but it's a process. And this, I think, we'll talk about hopefully toward the end. But this is very significant for me. So this, of course, is the process of urbanization. It's not about an urbe per se, but about a process. And as I say, I think Cerda had this kind of remarkable foresight, and that's what makes him, for me, so interesting. So it's not that, again, he sort of forms the basis of all modern history of the city and of architecture. In fact, he died penniless and sort of in obscurity, and no one really paid attention to him until recently. But rather, I think what he manages to do is to capture this sort of momentum at the time and really formulate it in this sort of spatial, political, economic, technical, legal theory of urbanization. And really, it has all of these components. And again, we start to see this as things emerging around the world today and have been for quite a while, perhaps. So I see him really as relevant not for somehow the practice of urban design, like why don't we do things more like Cerda? Already that happens anyways. But much more as a sort of way of understanding the discourse and history of urbanization. And he, of course, embraced this sort of idealism, which this quote can perhaps shed light on. He, again, saw this sort of historical autonomy forming around this idea of unlimited circulation, which he saw as a sort of freedom directly connected to technological innovation. And again, from this ideal, all others follow. So urbanization really was, I think this is also important, it was really intended as a radically anti-political gesture. He saw it as a sort of, the process of urbanization as opening a kind of virtuous world in which the management of infrastructure, services, etc., would render defunct any kind of need for politics whatsoever. So in a way, his duty, or everyone's duty at this point, was to embrace these new technologies of communication and transportation, really to announce the dawn of this bloodless revolution that he's calling for. This kind of awakening of a world united in peaceful process of circulation and urbanization. And of course, this would achieve a kind of universal connection of the whole of the world in this sort of one single urbe, or this process of urbanization. So you can see here, his idea of urbanization was to connect all these disparate little towns or small pueblos or cities in this kind of carpet of urbanization. And this, of course, doesn't stop there. He theorized the connection of the whole world, indeed, in one urbe. And I think what's really fascinating, in a way, is that Cerdà really made no distinction between political political form and spatial and material order. For him, I'll come back to that in a minute. For him, you really could draw and build political form. And this, for me, is very fascinating, especially today. So he saw really that urbanization in this new world would have no room for politics in the same degree that it would have no room for the city, as the city was really the physical product of this kind of ancient or ancient regime absolutist politics. Yet, of course, obviously, while aiming to replace or to sort of dismantle, in a way, state politics, Cerdà does not manage to eliminate it. And in fact, much more than a kind of innocent gesture, it's fine. Much more than an innocent gesture, Cerdà's entire body of work can rather, I think, be seen as an attempt to dismantle what remained of the sort of political mechanics of the absolutist state in his time, really only then to kind of reconstruct them in the image itself of the urban. And again, so the urban was really a spatio-political order for Cerdà, very much part of his theory. And it was very much a response to this kind of condition. And I think for that reason, for him, the discovery of modern freedom would really find its purpose in exactly what the state had always prohibited, which is unlimited circulation. So for Cerdà, really, the urban was this rise of a kind of edgeless world administered by a paternalistic provider of services, really, whose face would kind of disintegrate into this network of roads, rails, sewage pipes, etc. It was kind of the dawn, in my mind, of a new form of politics, new for the modern world, which really appears as its opposite. It appears as infrastructure, or as material kind of order of circulation, let's say. So again, just to emphasize, I mean, for me, I think it's this. What he manages to capture is really something of a new relationship forged between the urban and the political, which I think very silently persists today and somehow goes unexamined. So in a way, if the state had been the kind of universal, the space in which sort of universe, excuse me, let me back up. Getting ahead of myself. If the state had been the agent through which space had been given universal measure, by the 19th century, as Cerdà's theory really shows us, this role had been given over to the urban. And this is why it's so central to me. But again, rather than taking the 19th century as a sort of the birth of modern urbanization as a sort of historical origin, I kind of want to consider this rather a historical displacement or a sort of rupture in a kind of continuity between of power and material and spatial order that certain power assumes. So in other words, I want to examine urbanization as a kind of, as the appearance of a certain nomos, which a nomos essentially means a sort of tight unity between concrete spatial order and political form. So in a way, it's not to simply expose a kind of politics operating at the core of the urban, which we could maybe call biopolitics, but more than that, I want to ask, how can we look at urbanization rather as a sort of historically specific form, a material form that power assumed at a certain point in time and in certain places in time. So in other words, what I want to examine is, or what I want to frame is sort of this relationship between power and circulation, which we can see appearing not only through urbanization, but through other particular forms throughout history. So in essence, I start with a much more, let's say, modest question, which is to say that if a bond between modern biopower, if you want, and Tim, I think, illustrated that last week very well, If a bond between modern biopower and circulation can be located within urbanization, can such a coupling be found elsewhere in history? And if so, when and how did the city, in a way, kind of get entangled into this? And, how did the bond actually form between these two? So another way to put it is, how is it that circulation can be seen as a concept, a sort of principal concept of a sort of nomos? So just as a kind of disclaimer, I mean, I don't want to argue that, in the ancient city, no one circulated, and that circulation of goods or money or whatever didn't happen. Of course, that's not true. What I want to say is really, actually, there is a certain historical break in which really only recently circulation has been kind of brought to bear as a sort of crucial element or component of a city's or of a state's power. So I'm definitely not trying to argue that circulation didn't exist as such. So I want to just take a bit to look into this concept of circulation. First to say that it's not a kind of trans-historical concept. It did not exist, in fact, only until quite recently. In fact, it emerged only in a faintly recognizable form in the natural philosophies in the late 16th century, so, not so long ago. And so we're talking about astronomy, anatomy, and these kind of things. And of course, it was brought to light, and it couldn't have been brought to light outside of this sort of greater epistemological category of motu, or motion, which, discoveries by Kepler, Copernicus, Galileo, Descartes, Newton, all of this was very much predicated on this new sort of discovery of motion as a sort of central part of research. And then, obviously, preceding that, the discovery of circulation itself was really not possible without the more ancient kind of categories of circularity, circumference, concentricity, and what I could call, in short, the sort of metaphor of the circle. For millennia, really, the circle has been used to describe not only kind of the immanent order of earthly corporeal objects that are kind of bound up in cyclical motion, like water cycles or things like this, but also it really described a kind of order which reflected the observations of heavenly kind of orbital, let's say, motion of the planets and stars. The circle is really a symbol of perfection, and it appears ubiquitously throughout the natural world. It's a kind of primary mark of providential divine force at work in the world, sort of leaving its traces in trunks of trees, in stems of plants, in the circular perfection of the human body, sort of binding truth and necessity within this sort of consistency of the universe, sort of relationship. So the circle really inscribes and unites the world in its sort of divinely rotating patterns by which the heavens project their daily, seasonal, yearly displays of light and dark, imposing a kind of strict regularity into it, which sets in motion the activities on Earth, setting them in motion themselves. And I think the zodiac is one of the first pictorial representations of this sort of cyclical, circular principles that govern the universe and that govern the very earthly, fleshy life. So really, the binding of this rotation of kind of cosmic patterns in the sky somehow confer into the body certain observations, like basically the fate of the human body is somehow captured with these projections of the cosmos. For Plato, for example, the metaphor of the circle really provided the singular proof of what he called the God's hand in fashioning a world as a spherical whole composed of all other wholes. And this is kind of captured in Kepler's Mysterium Cosmographium. So the idea that the perfection of the world was really, it was something that was captured in the spinning circular rotation. From the Hellenic period through the Middle Ages then, the circle also remained a kind of symbol of fortune, so the idea of a wheel of fortune, which itself waxes and wanes just like the moon. By the 12th century, this kind of common understanding was really prevalent, which is that God we can describe as a circle whose center is everywhere and whose periphery or circumference is nowhere. In short, the metaphor of the circle was really the basis between which a kind of new relationship, or not new relationship, but a kind of long-standing ancient relationship between microcosm and macrocosm could be constructed. So between the sort of immanent earthly life, the body, etc., and its sort of divine and cosmic governance. And this is something which really persisted throughout Western life up until the Renaissance. It provided, this means by which we could relate divine providence, again, as a sort of form of governing in a way over earthly life and sort of seasonal and pattern ways of which we live. By the 15th century, the great separation between these two spheres, what we find is actually interesting, that this separation begins to sort of condense and shrink. And indeed, the infinite circle, which had previously described God, also suddenly began to describe the universe, in Bruno, nature, with Pascal, and eventually human intellect itself. So that's to say that the collapse of sort of the macrocosm into microcosm really meant that each individual was him or herself a sort of center. So no longer was God, described as a center with a circumference. But really the center was somehow within the intellect, the capacity of intellect. So in a sense, you begin to coexist with, as a sort of microcosm, with the macrocosm by sort of leaving the fleshly, earthly world and somehow transcending into this sort of infinite space of the intellect, the sort of limitlessness of the mental sphere. And really one of the outcomes of this was that the vast kind of infinity of what is now the kind of measurable universe it no longer appears as a sort of matter to simply observe these kind of natural systems of circulation, of circularity, as evidence of divine work, but rather now it becomes kind of incumbent upon mankind's intellect to grasp these, to explain them, to calculate, and moreover to predict them. So in this sense, truth is dislodged from its sort of from God as the center, and really it itself begins to circulate through this network, if you want, of individual centers through the human intellect. So by the end of the 16th century, the universe, which was now a kind of synthetic whole, observable to this centered subject, if you want, would really open out onto a new epistemological horizon. We often call this the scientific revolution, which in a way kind of flattens this whole thing that I'm trying to say out. But and within this, the perception of circular motion, which is discovered at this point to be really the only sort of absolute form of motion, the one which can only be measured against itself. It really, like the idea of circulation really emerges as a concept for the first time. And of course, this circulatio is first spoken. This is really the beginnings where William Harvey, of course, discovers circulation, the circulation of the blood. And it's very interesting because at this point, circulation becomes not something that simply confirms this sort of relationship that we have between, let's say, the natural world and our observations, nor does it, just simply provide a model which we understand through, which we always previously understood through these sort of heavenly ideas, but really becomes a notion which is detached from anatomy itself. It circulates itself. So, and I think what's fascinating is that you find that it begins to enter into questions of organization of human affairs. So Lewis Roberts dedicates his Merchant's Map of Commerce in 1638 to William Harvey. And in fact, William Harvey's 5, I think, brothers were all involved in trade. And then, of course, on the other side so we have trade on one side, which is beginning to give a certain order to the world. On the other side, Thomas Hobbes, Leviathan. Thomas Hobbes is actually a good friend of William Harvey's. He sat in on his vivisections. And in fact, he also takes this notion of circulation as a certain core idea in his construction of the Commonwealth, or, in a way, the sort of beginnings of the modern state. So really, circulation has entered immediately at this point in the 17th century into the kind of construction of world affairs and the thought of world affairs. And this is interesting because at this point, man's intervention into the natural world would really appear increasingly as also itself the natural world. So that's why, in a way, circulation became so easy to adapt into this model. In other words, basically the modern world would be constructed by newer and more sophisticated systems of objects that we constructed, thoughts, materials, etc., all bound up in this kind of new new modes of circulation, only to be somehow retroactively perceived as the work of a divine, invisible hand. And of course, this we might understand through the notion of economics. So with this, really, circulation would make itself available, in a sense, to power for the first time as a sort of domain of control, or a structure of control. And this, of course, happens at the emergence of the modern state, 17th century, in Europe. So I wanted to start talking a bit about how this begins to materialize, how we start to see circulation and visualize it, and how it becomes a way that we then can visualize things which may be otherwise abstract to us. So at this point, there are all these theories of state reason, which is a sort of logic underpinning the modern state. And in that sense, circulation itself became increasingly central to political calculations. So essentially folding the objectives of this state reason, of state power, into the very movement of objects, money, subjects, merchandise, silver and gold, throughout its territory, the state territory. And so it's also in this period that circulation, of course, gives birth to the notion of economics. Rather, of course, this takes place in perhaps the 18th century. And this is really because economics is discovered to be central to the power of the state itself. So through physiocracy, we start to see circulation playing a central role as a kind of, proto-diagram. I don't want to say diagram again, but as a sort of basic structure of how we can begin to organize an economic system. And the way this played itself out into the material world really is simple. In fact, if economic circulation really and exchange depended on this dislodging of wealth from a sort of fixed entity, so not buried in gold and stored away, but rather transferred into these things like money, which we can circulate and exchange, it would only do so insofar as the actual infrastructures were there and the concrete sort of channels and corridors were in place to provide that circulation, a means to circulate. So in that sense, circulation begins to take on shape within the space of the state. For this reason, within the kind of administrative knowledge and the planning of the state, of the territory, there emerged really an analytic category which made itself useful to this extent and became thus fundamental for the analysis of the state, which was traffic. And I really see traffic as a sort of beginning of a kind of material confirmation of state power, insomuch as it is also the vector by which state power is achieved. It becomes a kind of register in a way. So just as infrastructure makes circulation of wealth possible, it also registers it in space and in the experience and the sort of new forms of visibility of the new territorial state. And we can get into this notion of visibility perhaps later. So I think the first person to really take this on board and to start projecting it as a concrete plan was really Jean-Baptiste Colbert, whose administration over France, of course, really, he was the first kind of economic program which not only saw the kind of planning of Paris as a central, the capital of France, but really as just the sort of beginning of a whole planning of a territory. So it's a program of boulevards, roads, bridges around Paris, but also really a vast new network of these roads, bridges, tunnels, canals, connecting the whole territory into one kind of single controllable space. And really, Colbert was the first to kind of initiate this new governmental horizon, which is relevant, of course, to the framework of a territorial state. And within this, there's this radical new kind of emphasis placed on the space of the territory. So moving away from the city as a sort of central hub necessary of politics, and an emphasis more toward the territory. So in a way, his planning of Paris really was more focusing a kind of interface between the city itself and the territory beyond, I think, rather than the city, restructuring the city, as would later take place with Haussmann. In a sense, this new tradition that he inaugurated in the 17th century was taken up in the next century, in the 18th century, by the École des Ponts et Chaussées, which were really the first engineers. They were architects who distinguished themselves from architects who were, of course, concerned with, glorifying the state, making kind of timeless pieces of architecture within the city, really engineers were responsible in a sense for planning the territory, and this is the birth in a way of planning. It was an arm of the state whose task was to oversee the administration of the territory. And in a sense, it was to make this territory a space of economic circulation. They were very much inspired by the Nôtre and, as we see, Versailles here. This Versailles model, if you want, after, by the 18th century, just spills out as a sort of universal model for the ways in which we begin to plan the space of the state. So again, the territory really becomes a new datum for the kind of political datum for the modern state. And it's really the space of the state then had suddenly to be known in its kind of factual totality. So this is really the moment when kind of cartography and triangulation start to become used as a way to kind of map out, everything. So because wealth is, of course, extracted from the territory, everything had to be accounted for. Where are forests, where are rivers, where can we extract minerals? Everything had to be known. And in fact, the Cassini family here did this map, which, when you put all of these kind of pieces together like this, is something which is roughly 40 feet by 40 feet long. This is the totality of what we had to know somehow at a certain point. So resources, topography, geology, geography, hydrology, all had to be kind of precisely mapped. And I think what's fascinating really is what you see in this emphasis of the territory is a kind of divide. And this drawing somehow captures it. Obviously, it's not a city, it's a castle here in England. But I think it expresses it well. You see this divide between the territory and the city. Again, pretend that's a city. The territory really appears as this empty and, in fact, artificial space. And a lot of people would assume that the landscape is a space of nature, which it is. But really, it effectively becomes a space for artificial planning. This kind of geometric order of space begins to take hold. It's a space which can, and therefore kind of must, be controlled through this precise geometric calculus. In turn, the city itself becomes a kind of geological entity among others. It can be cataloged, it can be sort of mapped out and understood, how many people live there, the size of it and everything, just as a kind of forest can be mapped out, how much resources, how much wood is there, etc. And in that sense, it really starts to fall outside of this kind of territorial logic. It's a space that really cannot be subject to this territorial planning or this notion of infinite or sort of unlimited, if you want, unlimited circulation that the planning of the territory really took for granted. And for that reason, what we find is that actually to control the space of the city was not something through planning, because planning in that sense didn't yet exist, but really through this device of the police. And it's something, of course, Foucault has written extensively about, so I won't go into it so much now. Just to say that really the control of the space was done through this new administrative apparatus who would kind of fastidiously go through the city and maintain circulation. So I think for me what's interesting is that at this point, really there's a crisis. The city itself falls into a kind of epistemological crisis. And this is really because the dominance is on the space of the territory over that of the kind of city. Really, the city was not itself a sort of sovereign singularity. It was a sort of node in a way in a network of other cities, and had to be seen as such. And really, the territory was the new political entity, the polity, if you want. So both the city and the territory, nevertheless, had to submit to the same dominant logic of circulation. And it could be achieved much easier in the space of the territory than within the city. So, while the territory, through its kind of emptiness and availability to geometries and this geometric planning of state reason, it allowed for the development of a new, sophisticated form of political control to unfold through the roads, canals, etc. Really, the city itself did not have this and had to kind of compensate with this idea of the police apparatus. And of course, this crisis would only increase into the 19th century because the sort of reorganization of the nation state and the rise of capitalism would then place new emphasis, sort of political economic emphasis, back on the city, and then the city would just become overflooded with people. But really, I think what I want to say is that it was really this perception of the city, which I think kind of forms the basis of a truly modern understanding of the city. That is, the city within a territory. And it was, another way to say it is it really was only when the city was encountered as this kind of strange entity from without, from the kind of gaze of a territorial planner, that a kind of entirely modern perception of the city as an entity within a territory would present itself. And this is something that maybe would take some time to unfold, but by the 19th century, the rise of urbanization, I would argue, kind of answers this. And of course, I think this transition to urbanization, again, I come back to Serdar, this transition is something which I don't have time to go into. It really deserves its own lecture. However, what I want to say is like the basic relationship established between this administrative knowledge, infrastructure, and circulation, which were all developed in the territory of the state, really kind of form the foundations upon which 19th century programs of urbanization would all unfold. Yet it's exactly by insisting on this kind of historical divide that we do that this kind of history, I think, for myself, is completely missed and gets lost. So in a way, the discovery of all these modern universals that I mentioned earlier all seem to belong strictly, in that sense, to this modern period. And really, they therefore have no history, they have no political preconditions or ontology. So in this way, I want to argue that when we interrogate the nature of political form, there appears to be more of an inconvenient continuity in the history of the Western city than some of its historians may feel comfortable admitting. And again, what's lost in this is the importance of circulation, not simply as a concept relevant to the city as it is today, but as a metaphor and a model for which for millennia has connected absolute power, whether you're talking divine, natural, or political. And this is even more pressing to recognize today when precisely because the relationship between circulation and political power would, to many, seem accidental or oblique. So finally, to conclude, the nexus between political power, the city, and circulation indeed thrives behind a kind of dauntingly naturalized apolitical veil of urbanization. In the urban, things just happen. Urbanization has really come to be viewed as a vague, unquestioned background of the human condition. Both itself and its more scientific partner, urbanism, have bizarrely come to serve as a receptacle for all processes relating to the city that somehow remain beyond question. The repository of facts which we do not wish to doubt, yet somehow we love to count. The urban thus persists as a kind of universal constant. It's a kind of inevitable horizon of the human condition. It presents itself as a kind of blinding reality which only has to be understood by learning from it, learning from its tendencies, monitoring its processes, and mapping its effects. So in a way, as we kind of gaze bewilderedly into this utter nature of urbanization, we really seem helpless but to reproduce it in all of the various urbanisms that suddenly multiply and appear across the gloss of new books and on the websites of corporate offices. So new urbanism, landscape urbanism, unitary urbanism, computational urbanism, participatory urbanism, magical urbanism, integrated urbanism, smart urbanism, sustainable urbanism, new suburbanism, ecological urbanism, relational urbanism, and I'm sure you could find plenty more. Despite, or perhaps because of its vagueness, the urban has become an increasingly popular subject of multiple discourses, as we know. So from architecture to sociology to geography, each one applies its own framework of knowledge and its own scale of analysis. Yet increasingly, in all accounts, there's a tremendous lack of understanding of the political dimension and the historical basis of urbanization. Two categories which I argue seemingly bound together in this sort of obscurity of dogmatic disregard. I believe this is part of the reason why the urban will remain at once known in its factual totality while neglected completely in its ontological consistency. And indeed, what I want to kind of argue is that what is needed is to radically open up a new understanding of the urban outside of any traditional discursive framework, and precisely along these lines as a political an ontological category. Thanks. This I'll just leave up there for you.
Yeah, of course.
Okay. I knew it.
Serta seems to be a very Serta seems to be a very important figure for you, and I'm wondering if you have this aversion to ontology. Maybe genealogy is a better word for you to use. And
That's what I used
the
to
question
have.
is, who kind of precedes Serta in your mind, and who are the kind of people who follow him? And I'm wondering if that's a clear way for you to track through this alternate genealogy that you're setting up, because you kind of show a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, really, I think for me, if you want to know who precedes Serda in time, I would say it's really two things. I mean, well, many things, really. I think, obviously, this territorial planning is something I think very significant as a sort of new logic that appears, which eventually, what I want to argue, by the 19th century, becomes integrated into the planning of the city. And this happens, of course, through Haussmann, I would argue. So this idea of cutting through this empty territory, I mean, you really see it in, his planning of Paris. Let me just jump to that very quickly. But basically, it's taking Paris no longer as this kind of sacred space in a way, but almost creating this kind of gray background, this sort of empty space by which you cut through. And this is really, I think, taken from the logic of territorial planning. And Serda is really, he's a contemporary of Haussmann, and in fact, I think he's even a friend. They had certain exchanges. Yet he remains very critical of this, and he says, well, you can't just cut through the city, you need to also extend it. And so his reform and extension are really two, a sort of response, a twofold response to this problem that was posed to them in the 19th century. But the other figure that I would bring in would be really, the colonial grid, not just because Serda uses a grid, but he really references it. And I think what we don't see in Paris, I think, this problem of Haussmannization that everyone says Haussmannization is the beginning of the modern city and all this, and it's a sort of universal template that we have today everywhere. Yes and no, I would say. I mean, for me, if you go to Paris, you see that it's really not necessarily the template of what we understand of urbanization kind of everywhere, generically happening today. And in that sense, I think Serda's response to Haussmann by including this generic, expandable grid, this really creating a horizon and a process, was a fundamental advance, if you want. I don't know if that's a kind of perverse word, in this construction of the urban or urbanization. So it's really those two figures. I'd say the territorial logic and the colonial settlement, both of which were somehow outside the realm of the European city, and then both were somehow brought in.
Yeah. Interesting enough, I think territory, which has kind of really been in the forefront of the field right now, is quite contested in the fields of both history of art and history of science. So, for example, the history of cartography or hydrology, geology that you've mentioned now is linked to things like GPS infrastructure. There's a thesis at the GSD that was just done kind of recently about that. And mapping.
Is that with, what's his name?
Bill Rankin.
Oh, okay. I was thinking Neil Brenner.
But yeah, no, I think it's an interesting logic. But I'm also just wondering if it's separate from the question of circulation you bring up via mobility, because I think that's another kind of animal altogether.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah, like object building as object and portable culture, etc.
Okay, yeah. Let's talk about that at dinner.
I wonder if there's not a certain elision takes place.
Sorry?
Elision takes place, or implicit, when you move from talking about a limited circulation, such as the blood within the body, which is finite, and the unlimited circulation of things like money, and of course populations.
Sure.
Could you say something about that?
Absolutely. That's a good point. I think, because a lot of the early interpretations or sort of displacements of the model of circulation that Harvey provided, a lot of them really embraced this idea of a closed circulation within a body. So, the body politic of the state was understood as circulation of wealth within a closed entity. And that very much kind of underpinned the early political theories of the state. It was not about exchange necessarily, except only later as a kind of very controlled process between states. It was much more the circulation of wealth within a kind of kind of defended entity. And that even goes for the sort of, if you want, the sea powers. So England, the imperial powers, the navigational acts by Cromwell also inscribe a certain body, if you want, within this network that spreads around the world of trade. So in a way, the beginnings of circulation as an organizational principle of the state very much take on board this closed notion. It's really, I think you mentioned population, circulation, the unlimited circulation of money. All of these were really ideals that were born, I think, more or less in the 18th century, and then came to fruition in the 19th.
Except that I'm kind of, especially since Cerdo is Spanish, and I think it's true to say, maybe wrong, that it was Spain and the importation of silver that was the agency of the first really great inflation.
That's right.
And the point about the influx of silver is that it exceeds any limited circulation.
Yes.
And so you get the phenomenon of inflation.
Mm-hmm.
And then a kind of, there's a sort of sublime about that because it sort of spills over beyond.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very much. I agree. I think these were problems that sort of emerged in the planning of mercantilism, if you want, and the restructuring of the theories of early economics that came out. But really, with the physiocrats in the 18th century, wealth was something that was seen to be extracted from the territory, from landscape, from nature. And it's interesting, and I don't know totally the details about how this sort of problems were resolved. But generally, when these theories were emerging, it was within this kind of closed entity. But I think you're right. I mean, obviously, you bring in this sort of surplus, and it can't, this closed entity of the state or even the empire can't cope with that. And it creates a crisis. This is something capitalism, of course, resolves.
Thank you for the talk. That's great. And I also like to ask a question about blood, actually, because I
get faint. So
the early anatomical explorations, they were able to identify blood. Let's say they identify blood vessels that runs around the body, and then they're able to identify circulation as such, like you explained. But it's very difficult for them to actually isolate blood. So the substance that goes in the vessel is a much later story and requires a very different technique to identify how it flows and what kind of substance goes into the channels.
Yes.
And there seemed to be a very interesting parallel about urbanism as well. In the early days where the path and the roads are being emphasized, but what really flows in the path and the roads is sort of, it can be of many things, but we don't know yet. We'll see about that. And it could be military or it could be economical, etc. And I just wanted to ask, in your ontology, like what would be the distinction between the channel and the substance in the channel? In that sense, I just thought that, of course, it's a limited topic you can cover for the talk.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to ask that.
That's a very good point. And actually, I hadn't really posed it myself in that sense of, understanding or finding the substance flowing through the roads and railways was not railways, but let's say canals at this point, was something unknown. It's interesting. I hadn't considered that. I feel my tendency is to think that the construction of roadways was really a way to actually know this and to actually visualize it and see it. And in a sense, this is what I'm trying to say about, that when the space of the state, if you want, moves from, let's say, the city, sort of medieval city or whatever, the city-states, if you want, to this new territorial entity. I think there's something about circulation and these networks and moving through them that actually helps visualize this otherwise infinite and imperceptible entity. I don't think that's really answering your question, probably, but I think it's a fascinating point. I have some students out there. Oh.
Kind of maybe in a way, kind of add to the question. It doesn't really kind of pose itself as a question. I think the what it is that travels within circulation is in a way something of a mystery. How can I put it? It's on the one hand the blood of the system, economically, but it's also what goes with the blood. So I always think it's interesting that there's a sort of relation in English, but also obviously a kind of confusion. If you take the verb to truck, you know, in Adam Smith, it means to exchange, where obviously also the truck is what transports the object in our terms, like on the road. So it does seem to me there's both the linguistic, but actually a kind of perfectly substantial issue as to what it is that circulates if that circulation is going to be productive. It's as if what should be circulating is exchange itself, whether while it's always too early or too late to establish, you know, you can't really do, or you couldn't do till quite recently, like exchange on the run. Maybe now that's precisely what the electronic kind of circulation involves, that it just becomes a pure signifier of exchange without the need for any signified.
Interesting. That's
Which also, I think, goes back to the question about kind of silver. I mean, the reason, it's not just that it caused what we would call inflation in the 16th century, it's that no one had any idea about that, because to them the silver was wealth. It was only in a sense when you could posit the idea that silver represented wealth, and even that turns out to have been completely kind of inadequate. So, you know, it's more, I mean, there's a very beautiful chapter on this in Michel Foucault's The Order of Things. It's about how precious metals are differently conceived as representing wealth, and then how finally industry itself comes to represent wealth.
Thank you. Yes.
Another question?
Hi, Ross. Well,
Hi.
First, thanks for the talk. And maybe just a question that kind of leads maybe somewhere off the last one, which is, I mean, just starting with an observation, which I think is that it seems like in your use of circulation, one of the things maybe you're more concerned with is not the fine particularities of the metaphor, but it's self-evidence to those who use it, right? So the idea that circulation is not something that would have to be accounted for, but rather provided a logic which was unquestionable, right?
Yeah.
But just to kind of take that into your account a little bit more, because you didn't start with circulation, or rather with the circulation of blood, that came kind of almost halfway through your account. You go quite a bit further back. And it seemed like at one point you were actually arguing that this is something that historians have resisted, this idea that actually this is quite a robust and sustained kind of force or source of power through history of the sovereign. But I was also interested because it seems like, at least in your talk, there wasn't a whole lot of fine distinction between, what's the word for it, like specific kind of iterations of the meaning or the power of circulation at a specific point in time.
Right.
So I'm trying to think what my question was. I guess if you could comment on maybe, I don't know what the word for it, the provenance of certain forms of circulation, like, because it seems like circulation must have meant, even though it has a very long history, I would imagine, for instance, that modern governments, or maybe I'll pose it as a question, do you think that modern administration relies on metaphysical or alchemical notions of circulation as a source of its power and self-evidence? Does that make sense?
The secret societies, they read this stuff and...
Well, we still talk about the Masons, but I don't know if that's what you're talking about.
No, I don't think so. No, of course not. I guess what I want to show is really that there is something about, rotating motion, circularity, all these kind of things that somehow reverberate through history and, in a way, highlight a relationship that we have with a certain visibility of a phenomenon, let's say, and a power that it embraces or encompasses. And then how eventually this slowly begins to transition into something which we can actually reproduce. So it becomes kind of available to our own rational logic, let's say, to think about making systems that circulate and systems that move and rotate.
But in your work, you've not only identified sort of like colonial territories as a certain precursor for domestic territories and then, as it were, the city, but also kind of what you might call the maritime.
Yes.
The maritime in terms of having an ocean of circulation which has, maritime roads, etc., etc. And on the basis of your relation to the maritime, wouldn't it seem possible that also circulation, it's related to the circling of the globe?
Yes, absolutely.
And circumnavigation.
Absolutely, yeah. So,
even if it feels a bit sort of odd with going from London to Luton.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, as I said, like, the discovery of circulation, of course, happens within the whole idea of the epistemological horizon of motion, which had really taken hold, but also because there were these long-standing ideas of circularity, circumference, and circumnavigation is completely, in a way, if you want to take Carl Schmitt's argument, the modern nomos of the Earth was really discovered in a way, or created through two crises. The first is the sort of religious revolutions, or wars rather, within Europe, but before that was the kind of discovery of the Americas and this actual experience of the physical circularity of the world. So no longer is it simply something we can identify through astronomy or whatever techniques we have, but actually we can physically experience it by going around in a boat and coming back to the same place you left. And I think this completely, this notion definitely worked into the sort of discourses of trade and the circle of commerce, as it were, that were emerging at that point.
Can I just pick up this money thing again?
Oh, okay.
Or in particular, actually to do with coins, because I think
They're round.
I think it's true to say that yes, there's been a kind of anxiety about money since the Greeks, that like it just you can't.
2008, or are we talking about?
Yeah, the ancient Greeks. Yeah. I mean, that you can't be sure of how far it's going to go, or where it's been, and it disanchors value from location and identity and so on. And to that extent, although it seems to lubricate circulation, it seems to breed leakage, as it were, and promiscuity.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. Yeah, I mean, I'm not a kind of expert on economics to any certain extent, but I think that's right, and I don't think I can add anything to that, actually.
Okay.
Sorry.
Is there a last question? Over here.
Thanks. I was just to follow up on that and ask another question that might be slightly outside of your expertise.
Unanswerable.
I was just wondering if you see any relations with communication media.
Yeah.
And I can imagine that this must have played a very important role in thinking about the sort of the role of circulation in kind of, or the way
Yes.
that circulation could be imagined and conceptualized.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, of course, the whole construction of the public realm, I think, is almost more relevant to urbanization itself. And of course, this comes out of the idea that we can circulate knowledge and we can, exchange pamphlets and this kind of thing. Very much rooted in like what is enlightenment from Kant and all this. I don't deliberately go into the whole construction of communication so much. I wish I could somehow, but simply I had to kind of draw a line somewhere. But I think it's nevertheless incredibly important, at least in the sort of late 18th century construction of these kind of beginning of modern ideals of, connecting the whole of the globe in one sort of perfect sphere of communication, which of course helped to fuel Serda's kind of idealism of the same through technology. And very much, this also helped to implicate technology into the whole story, so the printing press and everything. But yes, I'm not, I don't go so much into that myself, but it does work. That was the last question.
Ross, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.